You've heard the name before. Maybe it was late at night, some documentary playing in the background. Maybe a grandson mentioned it. Maybe you stumbled onto it yourself, the way curious people do. Anunnaki. And somewhere along the way, someone told you what they were. Ancient gods, aliens, myths, fairy tales carved by primitive people who didn't know any better. But here's what nobody told you. The tablets exist, the actual clay tablets, thousands of them, sitting in museums right now. Translated, catalogued, available, and what they say is nothing like what you've been told, not even close. I'm not going to sell you a theory today. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. What I am going to do is sit here with you, go through what those tablets actually say, word by word, and let you decide for yourself. Because you're old enough to do that. You always were. Let's start with the ground beneath our feet, not metaphorically, literally. In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard was digging through the ruins of ancient Nineveh, what is now northern Iraq, when he found something that would take decades for the world to fully understand. Tens of thousands of clay tablet fragments, broken, buried, scattered across a library that had burned nearly 2,500 years before he got there. The library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, a man who, by all accounts, was obsessed with collecting knowledge, every text, every story, every record he could find from civilizations older than his own. When those tablets finally made it to London, to the British Museum, scholars started the slow, painstaking work of piecing them together, like the world's oldest, most fragile jigsaw puzzle. And what they found inside those fragments changed everything. Stories, laws, letters, medical texts, astronomical records so precise they still make scientists uncomfortable, and myths, or what we called myths, describing beings called the Anunnaki. Now, here's where most people go wrong. They hear the word myth and they shut down. They assume myth means fiction, fantasy, something a child made up around a fire. But that's not what myth meant to the people who wrote these tablets. To them, myth was history. It was the record of what happened before writing existed in the form we recognize. It was the only container big enough to hold certain kinds of truth. The Sumerians, the people who wrote the earliest of these texts, weren't primitive. That's the first lie someone told you about them. They built cities while most of Europe was still figuring out agriculture. They had courts, contracts, schools, surgeons, brewers, and bureaucrats. They tracked the movements of planets with an accuracy that took Western science another 3,000 years to match. These were not simple people. And the Anunnaki were not simple characters in their stories. The word itself, Anunnaki, comes from Sumerian. The most widely accepted translation is something like those of royal blood or princely offspring. Some scholars render it as those who came from heaven to earth. There's debate. There's always debate when you're working with a dead language and fragments of clay. But what's not debated, what is sitting right there in the translations, available for anyone to read, is what role the Anunnaki played. They weren't worshipped the way we think of worship today. It wasn't the kind of trembling, eyes-to-the-floor reverence you might imagine. The relationship the Sumerians described was closer to something between employer and employee, parent and child. An authority you respected, sometimes feared, occasionally argued with. In one of the oldest texts we have, a poem describing the goddess Inanna, she argues with her father. She manipulates, she makes mistakes, she grieves. These are not all-powerful, untouchable deities sitting on clouds. They are complicated figures doing complicated things for complicated reasons. And that distinction matters enormously. Because when you read the tablets as records of beings with agendas, rather than symbols of cosmic forces, the whole story shifts. It stops reading like mythology. It starts reading like something else entirely. History tends to do that when you get close enough. Think about the stories you grew up with, the ones your parents or grandparents told about people who came before. How much of that was cleaned up? How much was simplified so it would fit in a sentence, a lesson, a warning? How much of what you thought you knew about your own family, your own past, turned out to be more complicated when you finally got the full picture? That's not a failure. That's just how human beings carry time. We compress, we summarize, we let the edges blur. The Anunnaki story has been compressed for 200 years of modern scholarship, and for thousands of years before that, by every culture that inherited pieces of it and reshaped it to fit their own worldview. What we're going to do in this video is try to uncompress it, slowly, carefully, not to arrive at a conclusion, but to ask better questions than the ones most people are asking, because the tablets deserve that. And so do you. There's a text called the Atrahasis Epic. You may not know that name. Most people don't. But you almost certainly know the story inside it. A great flood, a man chosen to survive, instructions to build a vessel, animals brought aboard, the world destroyed and remade. Sound familiar? The Atrahasis Epic predates the book of Genesis by at least 1,000 years, probably more, and it tells that story almost beat for beat, with one significant difference. In the Atrahasis, you can see why the flood happened, not just the moral reasoning we inherited later, the actual political situation among the Anunnaki themselves that led to that decision. Who voted for it? Who voted against it? Who warned the man, and why? Let me walk you through it. According to the tablets, the Anunnaki were divided into two groups. The higher ones, those who held authority, who made decisions, who sat in what the text calls the Great Assembly, and the lower ones, the Igigi, who were tasked with the physical labor, digging canals, moving earth, the hard, grinding work of building a civilization, and the Igigi rebelled. This is not a metaphor tucked inside the text. The tablets describe it plainly. The Igigi went on strike. They burned their tools. They surrounded the residence of Enlil, one of the most powerful of the Anunnaki, in the middle of the night and refused to continue. And so a solution was proposed. Create workers. Create beings who could carry the labor burden. Beings made, according to the text, from clay and from something else, something described as the flesh and blood of a god who was sacrificed for the purpose. Those beings were called Lulu, the primitive worker. Now, I want to pause here, because this is where things get genuinely uncomfortable, not because it's strange, but because it's familiar. The idea that human beings were created to serve, to work, to carry a burden that someone else no longer wanted to carry. That's not an alien concept to anyone who's lived long enough. You've seen it in history books. You've seen it in headlines. You've possibly seen it in your own life. The way certain people are positioned to do the labor while others make the decisions and collect the benefits. The Sumerians weren't writing fantasy when they described this. They were describing something they recognized, something in the structure of the world around them that needed a story big enough to explain it. Whether you take it literally or not, and we'll get to that question, the pattern it describes is one of the oldest patterns in human civilization, and the tablets don't end the story there. What happens next in the Atrahasis is that the Lulu, the workers, multiply faster than anyone anticipated. They fill the earth with noise, with life, with everything that comes with an expanding population. And Enlil, the authority figure, grows disturbed. He tries to reduce them, first with disease, then with drought, then with famine. Each time another Anunnaki, Enki, who is described throughout the texts as humanity's closest ally, the one who argued for their creation, the one who genuinely seems to care about them. Enki quietly intervenes. He teaches them how to survive. He undermines the plans against them. There is a conflict running through these texts that feels remarkably modern. One authority that sees the growing human population as a problem to be managed. Another who sees them as something worth protecting. And caught in the middle, humanity, not fully understanding what's happening above them, not fully understanding why the world keeps changing around them, trying to survive, trying to read the signs, trying to make sense of forces larger than themselves. I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound like mythology to me. That sounds like every century that has ever been lived. The specific details may be ancient, the clay, the canals, the names no modern tongue pronounces easily, but the dynamic, the one where powerful interests conflict and ordinary people bear the consequences, that dynamic didn't start with these tablets. These tablets just had the honesty to write it down. There's something else worth noting about the Atrahasis that rarely gets mentioned in the popular versions of this story. When Enki warns the man, Atrahasis, about the coming flood, he doesn't appear to him directly. He speaks through a wall. The text is specific about this detail. Atrahasis is instructed to listen to the reed wall, where Enki's voice comes through. Plausible deniability. Enki is breaking ranks. He's going against the decision of the Great Assembly, and he does it in a way that lets him claim he never directly told a human being what was coming. That's not the behavior of an all-knowing, all-powerful God. That's the behavior of someone navigating a political situation very carefully. Read it again, and tell me it doesn't remind you of someone you've known, someone who knew something they weren't supposed to share, and found a way to share it anyway, without putting their name on it. The tablets are full of moments like that, moments that feel less like scripture and more like witness testimony. There is a moment in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, one of the oldest written cosmologies we have, where the universe itself is described as being born from conflict. Not from peace, not from divine intention carefully executed, from a war. The text opens with two primordial beings, Apsu, who represents fresh water, Tiamat, who represents the salt sea, and from their mixing, from the collision of those two forces, the first gods are born, including, eventually, the Anunnaki. Now the younger gods are loud, disruptive. They disturb Apsu's rest, and he decides they need to be destroyed. Tiamat disagrees. There's a confrontation. Apsu is killed. Tiamat, grief-stricken and enraged, raises an army to avenge him. And from that war, from that chaos, a young god named Marduk steps forward. He defeats Tiamat, and from her body, the text is graphic about this, he constructs the world, the sky from one half, the earth from the other. I want you to sit with that image for a moment. The world built from the body of a defeated enemy. This is not the creation story most of us grew up with. It's not the gentle, ordered, 7-day construction of a benevolent architect standing outside his work. This is creation as consequence, as aftermath, the world as something that emerged from violence, from grief, from a conflict that nobody fully won. And yet, the Anunnaki are there, present throughout, given roles, given territories, given responsibilities in this new world that was built from chaos. They don't choose their positions from a place of perfection. They inherit them from a story that was already complicated before they arrived. Does that sound familiar? Most of us didn't choose the world we were born into either. We arrived in the middle of something, inherited the consequences of decisions made before we had any say, spent decades trying to figure out our role in a structure we didn't design. The Enuma Elish was written for people who felt exactly that way, people who looked at the world, its inequalities, its violence, its inexplicable beauty, its grinding cruelty, and needed a story that was honest enough to hold all of it without pretending it made easy sense. The Anunnaki in these texts are not symbols of perfection. They are symbols of authority navigating imperfection. And there's a profound difference between those two things. Now, let's talk about something the popular versions of this story almost never address. The Anunnaki had a leader. His name was Anu. He was considered the highest authority, the sky itself, in some translations. Father of gods. His word, theoretically, was final. And yet, almost every significant event in the Sumerian tablets happens without Anu present. Enlil makes decisions, Enki makes counter-decisions, Inanna negotiates, schemes, conquers, Ninhursag creates, Nergal rules the underworld. The whole vast machinery of Anunnaki civilization runs and occasionally breaks down, while Anu sits at a remove, consulted but rarely controlling. Scholars have noted this. Some interpret it as a reflection of how Sumerian city-states actually worked, with a nominal king whose authority was largely ceremonial, while the real power was distributed among competing factions. Others think it reflects something older, a memory of how power actually operates. How the person at the top of any structure is often less involved in the day-to-day reality than everyone below them assumes. And how the people in the middle, the ones close enough to power to use it, but not so high that they're constrained by ceremony, those are the ones who actually shape events. If you've worked in any large organization, any military, any government, any church, any family with a patriarch or matriarch who everyone deferred to, but nobody quite listened to anymore, you already understand this. The tablets are describing bureaucracy, ancient, cosmic, divine bureaucracy, with all the dysfunction that word implies. Enki and Enlil are brothers in most versions of the mythology, sons of Anu, and their conflict runs through almost every major Sumerian text like a fault line. They disagree about humanity from the beginning. Enlil seems to view humans as a practical problem, too many of them, too loud, too hard to control, too quick to outgrow whatever boundaries were set. Enki views them differently. There's a text, smaller, less famous than the Atrahasis or the Enuma Elish, in which Enki essentially brags about his connection to human beings. He describes teaching them, giving them knowledge, civilizing arts, the ability to read the stars, to work metal, to understand plants as medicine. The Sumerians called this the Me, a set of divine gifts, almost like downloads of civilization. And Enki was their keeper and their distributor, which raises a question that the tablets leave deliberately unanswered. Why would a being of that authority care so much about creatures that another being of equal authority considered a nuisance? What did Enki see in humanity that Enlil didn't? Or perhaps the better question, what did Enlil see that he was afraid of? Because fear and contempt often live in the same house. And the tablets, if you read them slowly enough, suggest that Enlil's hostility toward humans wasn't really about the noise. It was about potential. Potential he wasn't sure he wanted them to have. There's a story in Genesis that most people know only as a cautionary tale about pride. The Tower of Babel, people building something so high, so ambitious, that God himself felt compelled to stop them, scatter them, confuse their language so they could never coordinate like that again. That's the version most of us inherited, but there's an older version. In the Sumerian texts, there's a passage, scholars call it the Eridu Genesis, that describes a time when all humanity spoke a single language. And the gods, specifically the Anunnaki in their assembly, made a deliberate decision to end that, not because the humans were building something offensive, because they were becoming too unified, too capable. The exact phrasing in one translation reads something close to, "The people, with one voice. Enlil found this displeasing." That's it. No tower, no arrogance, no dramatic act of hubris, just people working together effectively, and a powerful figure deciding that needed to stop. Now, I'm not asking you to draw any particular conclusion from that. What I'm asking you to notice is the pattern across multiple ancient civilizations, across texts that developed independently, in different languages, in different centuries. There is a recurring motif of human capability being deliberately limited, of knowledge being parceled out selectively, of certain kinds of unity being treated as a threat by whatever authority sat above. The Sumerians wrote it into their cosmology. The Babylonians refined it. The Hebrews inherited a version of it, and every culture that followed shaped it into something their own people could absorb. But the thread is the same. Human potential, unchecked, unified, fully realized, makes someone nervous. And that nervousness has a very long history. Let's talk about Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is often described as the world's oldest work of literature. It's probably the most studied of all the Mesopotamian texts, and it's about a king, 2/3 god, 1/3 human, according to the text itself, who cannot accept mortality. Gilgamesh loses his closest companion, a man named Enkidu, and is shattered by it. Not like a king, like a person. The grief the tablets describe is raw and specific. He refuses to let Enkidu's body be buried for 7 days. He sits with him until a maggot falls from the corpse. That detail was not put there by accident. Whoever wrote that line understood grief, understood the way loss anchors you to the physical, how you keep waiting for something to change, even after you know it won't. And then Gilgamesh goes looking for immortality. He travels to the ends of the earth. Literally, the text describes the geography, and finds a man named Utnapishtim, who is, unmistakably, the same figure as the flood survivor, Atrahasis, Noah. Different name, same story, threaded across centuries. And Utnapishtim tells him something that stops the whole epic cold. He says that the Anunnaki, specifically Enlil and Anu, hold the tablets of life and death, that they have assigned mortality to human beings, that this was a decision, not an accident, not a flaw in the design, a choice, a deliberate allocation. And then, remarkably, he tells Gilgamesh where to find a plant that can restore youth. Not immortality, but something, a foothold against the inevitable. Gilgamesh finds it. He actually holds it in his hands. And while he's resting on the journey home, a serpent steals it. The serpent, in one of the oldest stories on Earth. Taking from a human being the thing that could have changed everything. You know that image? You've seen it somewhere before. What's less discussed is what Gilgamesh does after. He doesn't rage. He doesn't launch another quest. He goes home to Uruk, his city, and he looks at the walls he built, the city he shaped, the thing that will remain after he is gone, and the epic ends there, quietly, with a man looking at what he made and deciding that it's enough. Now here is what I find remarkable about that ending. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not a story about a man who finds immortality. It's a story about a man who learns to stop needing it. And that lesson, that particular turn, was considered important enough to carve into clay and preserve across thousands of years. Somebody wanted that idea to survive. The idea that a human life, fully lived, with all its loss and its limitation, might actually be sufficient. Not glorious, not transcendent. Sufficient. That's not the kind of ending you expect from a civilization supposedly consumed by servitude to alien overlords. That's the kind of ending written by people who had thought very carefully about what a life is worth, and what it costs to spend it chasing something you were never meant to have. The Anunnaki in the Gilgamesh epic are not villains. They're not heroes either. They're administrators of a system that includes death, that includes limitation, that includes the frustrating, infuriating, occasionally beautiful reality of being human in a world you didn't design and can't fully control, which is, again, where most of us are, right now, today. The tablets knew that. That's why they survived. At some point in the last 50 years, a man named Zechariah Sitchin became the most famous interpreter of Sumerian texts in the world. Not among academics, among everyone else. His books, starting with The 12th Planet in 1976, sold millions of copies. They argued that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a hidden planet called Nibiru, that they came to Earth to mine gold, that they genetically engineered human beings as a labor force, that everything we call civilization was essentially installed by visitors from another world. Sitchin was not a credentialed Sumerian scholar. He taught himself to read cuneiform, and the academic community, almost uniformly, rejected his translations as selective, inaccurate, and built around conclusions he'd already decided to reach. But here's the thing. He sold millions of books, which means millions of people were hungry for exactly that story, that specific explanation, the one that said, "You are not an accident, you were made. Someone came here and made you deliberately for a purpose. There's something worth understanding in that hunger, not the conclusion. The hunger itself, because what Sitchin's readers were really looking for, what they were responding to, wasn't necessarily ancient astronauts. It was meaning, the sense that human existence isn't random, that there's a hand behind the story, that someone, somewhere, at some point looked at humanity and decided it was worth creating. That's not a fringe desire. That's one of the oldest desires in recorded history. And the tablets, the actual tablets, the ones Sitchin used selectively and scholars have translated carefully, those tablets speak directly to that desire. Just not in the way Sitchin described. Let's look at what the tablets actually say about the creation of humanity, not the Sitchin version, the text itself. In the Atrahasis, the creation of the first humans involves Enki and a goddess named Ninhursag, sometimes called Ninmah. They are described as mixing clay with the flesh and blood of a slain god, breathing life into it, making something new. What that means, literally, is debated endlessly. Some scholars see pure mythology, the Sumerians explaining biological reproduction through divine metaphor. Others note that the language used is unusually specific, that the word translated as clay in some passages can also mean mud or earth, which is chemically closer to the mineral composition of the human body than most people realize. Others point out that the phrase about divine blood, Ilani Dami, the blood of the gods, has been interpreted as everything from religious symbolism to something more literal. Nobody has a clean answer, and anyone who tells you they do is selling something. But here is what the tablets say clearly, without ambiguity, without needing interpretation. The beings who made humans, whatever they were, regretted aspects of what they made. There's a text called the Dialogue of Pessimism, darker than most. A Babylonian text in which a master and his servant go through a series of exchanges. The master proposes an action, the servant agrees and gives reasons. The master reverses course, the servant agrees again and gives opposite reasons. It's deeply cynical, almost satirical. And at the end, the master asks the servant what is good, the servant's final answer, and this is one of the most striking lines in all of ancient literature, is essentially to have your neck broken and be thrown into the river, to drown, because who is tall enough to reach the heavens, who is broad enough to embrace the earth? That's the punchline. In a text that came from the same civilization that wrote about the Anunnaki building humanity, despair and creation sitting side by side. That tension between the act of making something and the exhaustion of sustaining it runs through nearly every culture's mythology. Every parent understands it in some form. Every person who has built anything, raised anything, committed to anything that outlasted the original enthusiasm. You make something, and then you live with what you made. The Anunnaki, as the Sumerians described them, lived with that, and so did the humans they created. Now, there's one more piece that almost nobody discusses when they talk about the Anunnaki, one that sits quietly in the texts and rarely makes it into the documentaries or the best-selling books. The Anunnaki were described as growing old, not immortal in the simple sense we assume, not untouched by time. Several texts describe Anunnaki figures as ancient, weary, carrying the weight of decisions made so long ago that the original reasoning has been partially lost. There's a passage in which older Anunnaki are described as weeping, not over a human tragedy, over their own, over what was asked of them before memory began. I don't know what to do with that fully, but I think about it. The idea that even the beings credited with creating civilization, with holding the tablets of fate, with controlling the forces of nature, even they grew tired. Even they carried something they didn't know how to put down. There's a strange comfort in that. Not because suffering at any level is acceptable, but because it suggests that the weight of existence isn't a punishment reserved for the small and the human. It might just be the cost of being conscious in a complicated world. The tablets were written by people who had looked at everything, the gods, the kings, the workers, the flood, the grief, the creation, and decided that honesty was more useful than comfort. They wrote what they saw, and what they saw was this: everything that has power also has a burden, everything that creates also loses, and everything that has ever lived has, at some point, sat in the dark and wondered if it was enough. The clay tablets say that, in Sumerian, in Babylonian, in Akkadian, across 4,000 years of human need to understand where we came from and why it feels the way it does. Before we get to the end of this story, and there is an end, one I think will stay with you, I want to stop for just a moment, not to sell you anything, not to perform enthusiasm I don't feel, just to say something honest. This channel exists because there are people out there, and I suspect you're one of them, who are tired of being talked down to, who spent 60, 70, 80 years reading, thinking, questioning, living through history in real time, and still get handed content that assumes they need everything simplified into a headline and 3 bullet points. You don't. You never did. What we do here is different. We sit with difficult material. We ask uncomfortable questions. We don't pretend the answers are simple just because the questions are old. If that's what you came here for, if this is the kind of conversation you've been looking for, then subscribe to this channel. Right now, if you haven't already. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next, because we do this every single day. New history, new questions, new reasons to think about where we came from and what it means, and share this with someone. Not because an algorithm needs it, because there's probably someone in your life, a friend, a sibling, a grown child, who thinks they already know everything, who needs to hear that the story they were told is not the whole story. It never was. Now, here's something I've been thinking about throughout everything we've covered today. We talk about the Anunnaki as if they're purely ancient, safely distant, sealed behind thousands of years of archaeology and dead languages and museum glass. But the questions they raised are not ancient. Who made us? For what purpose? Who controls what we know and what we don't? Who benefits from our labor and who decides when we've become inconvenient? Those questions were carved into clay in 3000 BC. They were asked in every century between then and now, and they are being asked today by people who would never in their lives pick up a book about Mesopotamia. That's the thing about the tablets that doesn't get said enough. They're not interesting because they're old. They're interesting because they're current. And now I want to bring you to the piece of all this that I've been holding back. The part that doesn't make it into the alien documentaries, doesn't get quoted in the skeptic forums, doesn't fit neatly into either the believer's argument or the dismisser's argument. The part that lives in a single tablet, discovered relatively late, translated carefully, and almost immediately set aside by everyone who wasn't sure what to do with it. It's called The Debate Between Sheep and Grain. Sounds minor, almost domestic. It's anything but. The text is a dialogue, Sumerians loved dialogues, between two gifts given to humanity by the Anunnaki, grain and livestock, each arguing for its own primacy, each making the case that without it, human civilization collapses. And partway through this debate, there's a line that stops everything, a line that describes the moment before these gifts were given to humanity, when humans, in the text's own words, ate grass with their mouths like sheep. They drank water from ditches, no grain, no domesticated animals, no tools, no cities. And then the Anunnaki intervened. Now. Scholars read this as mythological explanation for the agricultural revolution, for the transition from hunter-gatherer life to settled civilization. A perfectly reasonable interpretation. But read it again, with everything we've covered today still in your mind. What if the agricultural revolution, one of the most consequential shifts in all of human history, was understood by the people closest to it not as a natural development, but as something that was given, introduced, delivered from outside the normal pace of human progress? That question is not fringe. There are serious archaeologists, not mythologists, not conspiracy theorists, who have noted that the agricultural revolution happened with a speed that doesn't entirely fit the gradual model. That multiple crops were domesticated in the same narrow window of time in the same region, in a way that still doesn't have a completely satisfying natural explanation. I'm not telling you what to conclude. I'm telling you the question is more open than the textbooks suggest. And I'm telling you that the people who were there, who watched it happen, who built Sumer on the back of it, they had a very specific explanation. They said it was given to them by beings who had reasons of their own for doing it. Whether those beings were gods or ancient rulers mythologized into gods or something else entirely, the Sumerians were clear about one thing. Civilization did not emerge from humanity alone. Something helped, and something, in other moments, tried to stop it. That tension between the force that builds and the force that limits is the real story of the Anunnaki, not gold mining, not genetic experiments, not spacecraft. The real story is about power, about who gets to decide what humanity knows, what it can do, how far it can go. And about the few, the Enkis, the quiet ones, the ones who speak through walls, who keep finding ways to pass the knowledge on anyway. We started this conversation with a simple premise, that you've been lied to about the Anunnaki, and I want to be precise about what that lie actually is, because it's not the lie you might expect. The lie isn't that they were aliens, or that they weren't. The lie isn't that Sitchin was right, or that the academics who dismissed him were entirely right either. The lie is simpler than all of that. The lie is that this story is finished, that it's been examined, categorized, shelved, and resolved. That what the tablets say has been fully understood, fairly represented, and accurately passed down to the people who deserve to know it. It hasn't, not even close. There are thousands of tablets still untranslated, sitting in storage, waiting for scholars who have the funding, the time, the institutional support to get to them. There are translations that exist but haven't made it past academic journals into the kind of language that reaches people who don't spend their lives in universities. There is a vast, detailed, internally consistent record of how one of humanity's first civilizations understood its own origins. And most people alive today know almost nothing accurate about it. That's the lie. Not a conspiracy, not a shadowy suppression, just the ordinary grinding way that difficult knowledge fails to travel. The way the complicated version of any story loses ground to the simple version every single time, because simple is easier to sell and easier to share and easier to remember on a busy Tuesday when you have other things to think about. The tablets deserved better than that. And so did the people who wrote them. Think about who those people were for a moment. Not as ancient primitives, not as alien-influenced constructs, as people. People who woke up every morning in a city they built with their hands, who navigated power structures they didn't fully control, who watched their children grow up into a world that didn't always make sense, who looked at the sky and felt the same pull toward meaning that you have felt at some point in your own life. And they wrote it down. Everything they believed, everything they feared, everything they understood, and everything they couldn't quite explain. They pressed it into wet clay with a reed stylus, and they let it dry in the sun. They did that because they thought it mattered. They did that because they believed the people who came after them, however far after, however different, however separated by language and time and culture, those people would want to know, would need to know. You are one of those people. You are who they were writing for, not you specifically, but the human being who would eventually sit somewhere quiet, decades or centuries or millennia later, and feel the same questions they felt. Who would want to understand not just what happened, but what it meant? Who would be unsatisfied with the simple version, because the simple version had never quite fit the shape of what life actually felt like? That person. That's who carved these stories into clay and buried them carefully and hoped. I don't know what the Anunnaki were. I've read the tablets. I've read the scholars. I've read the critics of the scholars and the critics of the critics. And I still don't know. Not with the certainty anyone wants to claim, but I know what the Sumerians thought they were. They thought they were the architects of a world that was never finished. Beings who made decisions with consequences they couldn't fully anticipate, who disagreed with each other, who protected some things and destroyed others, who were present at the beginning of something and then gradually withdrew, or faded, or were forgotten, or became something else over centuries of retelling. And they thought humanity was the thing left behind, not abandoned, left behind, the way a teacher leaves a student, the way a parent eventually steps back, the way every generation eventually has to stand in a world that the previous one built and decide what to do with what they inherited. The tablets end, the stories stop, but the questions they asked are still here, still unanswered in the ways that matter most. Where did we come from? Who decided what we're capable of? What have we been kept from knowing, and by whom and why? And what might be possible if we finally knew the whole story? Those aren't ancient questions. They're yours, right now, today. And the fact that they were asked in Sumerian on clay 4,000 years before you were born, that should tell you something. Not about aliens, about humanity, about how long we have been standing here, looking up, asking the same things, refusing to accept that the official version is the whole version. That refusal is not ignorance. That refusal is one of the most human things there is. If this video made you think, not agree, not believe, just think, share it with 5 people. Not because I'm asking, because somewhere in your life there are 5 people who are hungry for exactly this kind of conversation and don't know where to find it. Send it to them. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't. We do this every day. History that respects your intelligence. Stories that don't insult what you've lived through. And leave me a comment below. Not a reaction, a thought. Tell me what landed for you. Tell me what you disagree with. Tell me what question this raised that I didn't answer. And if you have a topic you want us to sit with next, a civilization, an event, a mystery that stayed with you, write it down there too. I read everyone. Because this isn't a broadcast, it's a conversation. And you've been part of it since the first word.